His wife filed for divorce the day he closed a $58 billion deal she needed to survive. Not the day before, not the week after, the same morning, the same hour. While she stood in their kitchen with her mother beside her, laughing at a man she had spent 9 years calling a charity case, that man's phone was buzzing in his pocket with 2 words from his attorney that would dismantle everything she thought she had built without him. Here is what you need to understand before this story goes any further. This was not a man who got lucky. This was not a man who stumbled into power after his world fell apart. The power was already there, silent, patient, and completely invisible to everyone who underestimated him. And the cruelest part? The career she was so proud of. The family name she protected like it was sacred. The future she was so certain she had secured. All of it, every single piece of it, was running through him without her ever knowing. The question is not what he did when he found out she filed. The question is what happens when a man who has been silent for 9 years finally decides to speak. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now. These stories post every week and you do not want to miss what is coming. Drop a like if you are already feeling this one and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? Drop your city. I want to see who is in the room. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started, to a Tuesday morning in uptown New Orleans, to a kitchen that still smelled like coffee, and to a man standing at his own counter holding a folder that was about to change everything while his wife handed him the end of their marriage like it was nothing. The kitchen smelled like coffee nobody had made for him. Calvin Dewberry stood at the counter in his good shirt, the grey one, the one he ironed himself the night before, with his car keys in his right hand and a manila folder pressed flat under his left palm. The morning light was just starting to come through the window above the sink, the kind of pale gold that New Orleans does in September before the heat takes over. He had been up since 5. He had not slept much before that. The folder contained nothing dramatic, a few pages, some signatures already in place, a pen clipped to the inside. To anyone who might have glanced at it sitting there on the counter, it looked like homework, it looked like paperwork, it looked like exactly the kind of thing Dominique had been rolling her eyes at for 9 years. He heard them before he saw them. The click of Estelle Fontaine's heels on the hardwood was a sound Calvin had memorized the way you memorize something you have always needed to brace for. It was deliberate. It was announcing. It said, without any words attached, that whatever room Estelle was entering had just changed ownership. Dominique came in first, but only by half a step. She was dressed like she was going somewhere important, which Calvin noted the way he noted most things, quietly, without expression. Her hair was done. Her bag was the one she carried when she wanted people to see it. She set a manila envelope on the counter across from his folder and slid it toward him with 2 fingers, the way you slide something to someone you are no longer required to be gentle with. Calvin looked at the envelope. He did not touch it yet. "We need to talk about this," Dominique said, and her voice had the particular flatness of someone who had already finished the conversation in their own head and was only performing the beginning of it for the record. Estelle moved to the far side of the kitchen and stood with her arms folded, not sitting, never sitting, because sitting in someone else's kitchen implied a hospitality she had never once extended to Calvin in return. She had pearls on. At 7 in the morning, Calvin had long since stopped finding that remarkable. "I think," Estelle said, in the low and measured tone she used when she wanted to sound charitable, "that Dominique has been more than patient, more than generous. And I think you know, Calvin, that this was always a matter of time." She let that sit. Then she said the part she had probably been waiting years to say out loud, in his own house, in his own kitchen. "You are a lower ninth boy, and there is nothing wrong with that. But you never belonged here. And I think somewhere in that chest of yours, you have always known it." Calvin looked at her. He did not say a word. Dominique picked it up from there, her voice moving faster now, like she had a list and wanted to get through it. The partnership vote was in 6 weeks. The bonus, $340,000, that was already approved pending the vote. She had worked for this. She had built this. She did not need a placeholder anymore, and that was all Calvin had ever been, a placeholder, a stable and quiet and utterly unremarkable placeholder, while she became something. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He did not reach for it. Dominique kept talking. Estelle made a soft sound of agreement at regular intervals like a metronome. And Calvin stood at the counter in his good grey shirt and looked, for just a moment, through the kitchen window at his car parked in the driveway. The visitor badge was on the sun visor where he always kept it. Worn at the edges, the lanyard faded, the laminate just starting to peel at one corner. He had clipped it back there 3 days ago, after Dominique had picked it off the dashboard and dropped it in the trash without looking at it, without asking what it was, without any curiosity at all about why her husband carried it, or where it had been, or what those visits had ever been for. He had retrieved it from the trash without saying anything. He had clipped it back. He looked at it through the window now, while his wife listed his failures, and his mother-in-law stood witness to all of them, and his phone buzzed a second time, and he thought about the folder on the counter, and he thought about the badge on the visor, and he thought about 9 years of Sunday dinners at a table where he was always seated slightly too far from the center of things. Then he picked up the envelope, opened it, looked at the first page long enough to confirm what it was, set it back down. He picked up his own folder, he picked up his keys, he said, "Okay." Not as a question, not as a surrender, just as a word that closed a door quietly on its way out. He walked past Dominique. He walked past Estelle. He heard one of them say something behind him, but he was already at the front door, and the sound didn't reach him the way it was intended to. By the time he got to the driveway, Dominique and her mother were already laughing, the kind of laughing that needed an audience even when nobody else was in the room. Calvin unlocked his car. He sat down. He reached into his pocket and looked at his phone. 2 messages from Marcus Turode, sent 4 minutes apart. The first one said, "Closing confirmed. 9:02 this morning." The second one said 2 words. "It's done." Calvin sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Through the windshield, the morning had gone fully gold now, the way New Orleans mornings do right before the city shakes itself awake. He could see, just at the edge of the horizon past the rooftops, the faint industrial outline of the port. He clipped his badge back onto the visor. He put the car in reverse, and he drove. To understand what that phone message meant, you have to understand where Calvin Dewberry came from, and most people never bothered to ask. He grew up in the lower 9th Ward in a house that his grandmother, Ida Mae Dewberry, had owned outright since 1974. It was a small house, yellow with white trim, sitting on a plot of land that flooded twice before Calvin was born, and once more when he was 7. Ida Mae never left. She just dried it out, painted it again, and stayed. Calvin watched her do that and filed it somewhere permanent inside himself. The understanding that land was the only thing that held when everything else moved. He was a quiet child who became a quiet man. He read everything he could find about port operations, freight logistics, commercial real estate, not because anyone told him to, because the port of New Orleans was visible from the levee 2 blocks from Ida Mae's house, and from the time Calvin was 12 years old, he used to sit up there and watch the ships move and think about who owned the ground they docked on. He put himself through Tulane on a combination of scholarships and night work. He earned a finance degree, then a master's in commercial real estate. He did not celebrate either one loudly. He took a position at a small regional investment firm, stayed 4 years, learned what he needed, and left to build something of his own. He was 31 when he met Dominique Fontaine at a fundraiser for a legal aid organization in the warehouse district. She approached him. He was standing near the bar holding a glass of water, watching the room the way he always watched rooms, and she walked over and introduced herself with the particular confidence of a woman who had never once been told she was not the most important person present. He was reserved. She took that for depth, which it was, though not the kind she was imagining. They dated for 8 months. He met Estelle for the first time over a Sunday dinner in the Garden District, in a house that smelled like old money and fresh flowers, and something underneath both of those things that Calvin would later identify as performance. Estelle looked at him the way you look at a piece of furniture someone brought into a room you decorated yourself, assessing, tolerating, already planning where to put it so it caused the least disruption. They were married the following spring. Calvin kept working. He was always working, though no one in the Fontaine family ever fully understood what that meant, because the work he was doing did not look like the kind of work they respected. He was not making partner announcements. He was not flying to conferences. He was driving to port facilities. He was reviewing land surveys. He was meeting with a commercial attorney named Marcus Turode in a downtown office that had no signage on the door, formalizing a Delaware blind trust that he called Dewberry Oaks Capital, and beginning the slow and methodical process of acquiring port-adjacent properties along the Gulf Coast. He wore a visitor badge for it. He registered as a facilities consultant, which was not untrue. He was consulting on which facilities he intended to eventually own. The badge lived on his sun visor. Nobody ever asked about it. The first Sunday dinner where Estelle seated him at the far end of the table, Calvin counted the settings and said nothing. The first time she referred to Dominique's marriage as her daughter's season of charity, she said it to a friend in the kitchen, not quite quietly enough, and Calvin, passing through the hall with a dish he had brought, heard every word and kept walking. He set the dish on the counter, he went back to the table, he ate. Dominique's career at Thibodeau and Marsh was accelerating. In their 3rd year of marriage, she was promoted to senior director and inherited the Fontaine shipping account, the firm's largest, most complex client relationship. She worked it hard, and she worked it well, and she took every ounce of the credit because, as far as she knew, the credit was entirely hers to take. What she did not know was that by that point, Dewberry Oaks Capital already held controlling interest in 2 of the 3 terminal facilities that Fontaine Shipping used for its primary Gulf Coast operations. Calvin had purchased the positions quietly through layers of holding entities, all of it invisible to any surface-level search. The account Dominique was building her career on was running through infrastructure her husband was buying beneath her feet, one parcel at a time. The night Dominique was promoted, Estelle threw a dinner. The table was full. Cousins, church friends, the Fontaine family attorney. Champagne. A cake from the Good Bakery on Magazine Street. Dominique stood and accepted the room's applause with the ease of someone who had always expected to be celebrated. Calvin sat at his usual end of the table and watched her. He raised his glass when she raised hers. He did not say much. He never said much. And that silence, which the Fontaine had always read as smallness, was in fact the most expensive thing in the room, because the contempt was calcifying now, hardening into something the family no longer bothered to keep polite. And on the other side of that calcifying contempt, Calvin Dewberry was just getting started. The Pan American Bank Private Wealth Office sat on the 14th floor of a building on Poydras Street where the elevator required a key card and the receptionist did not smile at strangers. Calvin had been coming here for 6 years. They knew his face, they knew his name. They knew, more importantly, that when Calvin Dewberry arrived with a folder under his arm and a specific kind of quiet around him, you cleared the conference room and you held all calls. He walked in at 9:27, 45 minutes after leaving his own driveway. He had not stopped. He had not called anyone. He had driven through the city with the badge on the visor and the morning on his face and arrived exactly when he said he would. Marcus Turreau was already seated at the head of the table. Turreau was 53 years old and built like a man who had spent 3 decades winning arguments that other people thought were already settled. He wore a charcoal suit and reading glasses he only put on when he wanted to signal that he was about to be precise. They were on now. 4 members of the Dewberry Oaks Capital team flanked him. 2 attorneys, a financial analyst, and a closing coordinator who had been managing the documentation for this transaction for the better part of 14 months. Calvin set his folder on the table, pulled out the chair across from Turreau, and sat down. Turreau looked at him over the glasses and said, "You look like a man who just had an interesting morning." Calvin said, "Tell me where we are." Turreau told him. As of 9:02 that morning, the Dewberry Oaks Capital Blind Trust had taken full controlling interest in the Gulf Coast Logistics Network, 14 ports, 3 rail corridors, 47 miles of commercial waterfront stretching from the mouth of the Mississippi to the eastern edge of Mobile Bay. The total acquisition value, finalized and recorded, was $58 billion. It was the largest private port infrastructure transaction in American history. It had been assembled over 9 years through 41 separate acquisitions, all of them quiet, all of them registered through holding entities that traced back to a Delaware trust that bore no visible connection to a man named Calvin Dewberry. Calvin listened to all of it without moving. Then Turreau took off his glasses, set them on the table, and said, "There's something else you should hear today, given the circumstances." He opened a separate folder and laid 3 pages flat on the table between them. The visitor badge, Turreau explained, had served its purpose perfectly. 9 years ago, when Calvin first began his due diligence on Gulf Coast terminal infrastructure, he had registered as an independent facilities consultant under a subsidiary entity, a name that appeared on no document connected to his personal identity, his marriage, or his finances. That registration gave him access, physical access. He walked terminals, inspected loading infrastructure, reviewed capacity records in person, while wearing a laminated badge that said he was there to check the ventilation systems. Nobody had ever asked him a single substantive question while wearing it. Dominique had thrown it in the trash once, 4 years into the marriage, calling it clutter. He had retrieved it the same afternoon without comment. He kept it on the visor because it reminded him, every morning, on the drive to the port overlook, of exactly what patience looked like in practice. Then Turreau got to the part that Calvin already understood in broad strokes, but had never heard laid out in precise numbers. Fontaine Shipping and Transport, he explained, operated the majority of its Gulf Coast freight volume through 3 specific terminal facilities. Those 3 terminals, Terminals 7, 11, and 14 of the Port of New Orleans, had been held under separate lease agreements by various entities for years. As of 9:02 that morning, those lease agreements now resided entirely within the Dewberry Oaks Capital portfolio. René Fontaine's entire operational model depended on access to infrastructure that Calvin owned outright. Turreau set a second page on the table. Thibodeau and Marsh, the logistics consultancy, where Dominique held her senior director position, derived 61% of its annual revenue from a single client account. That client was Fontaine Shipping and Transport. Dominique's partnership vote, scheduled for 6 weeks from now, and her $340,000 performance bonus were both contingent on the continued financial health of that account. If Fontaine Shipping's operating position deteriorated, the partnership vote would not survive it. The bonus would not survive it. Her entire professional trajectory, the one she had announced at her mother's table, the one she had used that very morning to explain why she no longer needed Calvin, that trajectory ran directly through terminals Calvin had just closed on. The third page showed Commerce Gulf Bank's existing credit exposure to the Fontaine family, $4.2 million on an operating line, secured against projections that would no longer hold once the new lease terms arrived. Calvin looked at the 3 pages for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "How long before they feel it?" Turode put his glasses back on. "The moment we send the new lease agreements." Calvin reached into his folder and removed the final closing document, a single page requiring his signature as managing partner of Dewberry Oaks Capital, witnessed and notarized, confirming the transfer in full. Turode slid a pen across the table. It was a plain pen, the kind that did not announce itself. Calvin picked it up. It was the same pen he had brought to his own wedding. He had carried it in his jacket pocket that day because Ida May had told him once that you should always bring your own pen to anything important, because borrowed instruments make borrowed commitments. He signed his name. He set the pen down. He looked out the 14th floor window at the city below, at the distant industrial edge where the port met the river, at 47 miles of waterfront that now answered to a quiet man from the lower Ninth Ward, who everybody had always assumed had nothing. He had exactly one decision left to make. Turode's law office was 12 blocks from the bank, on the 3rd floor of a building that had been in his family since his grandfather practiced there in 1959. The conference room had dark wood paneling and a window that looked out over the street, and it smelled like old paper and coffee and the particular seriousness of a place where consequential things got decided quietly. Calvin had sat in this room many times. He had always felt like himself here. He sat down across from Turode at 2:15 in the afternoon. Turode had a legal pad and a pen. Calvin had nothing in front of him. He did not need notes for what he was about to authorize because he had been thinking about it in one form or another for a very long time. "Walk me through the sequence," Calvin said. Turode nodded and began. The first move was the simplest. New terminal lease agreements, drafted on standard Dewberry Oaks Capital commercial letterhead, would be transmitted to Fontaine Shipping and Transport through the same regulatory channel that all port lease renewals flowed through. Nothing about the delivery would appear unusual. Every Gulf Coast shipping company received periodic lease adjustment notices from terminal operators. The Fontaine family would open that envelope the way they opened every piece of business correspondence, with the confidence of people who had never once received news they were not prepared for. The rates in the new agreements would be tripled. The compliance window would be 90 days. There would be no Calvin Dewberry name on any page. Only Dewberry Oaks Capital, which meant nothing to the Fontaines, which was precisely the point. Turode moved to the second item without being asked. Commerce Gulf Bank, he explained, had a commercial lending division that maintained standard exposure review protocols for all major clients. If a significant shift in a borrower's financial position came to their attention through credible third-party documentation, that review triggered automatically. It was not a choice, it was a procedure. As a courtesy, Turode would forward Fontaine Shipping's revised terminal cost projections to Commerce Gulf's lending division. No accusation, no complaint, just data properly formatted, sent through appropriate channels by an attorney whose name was on a bar association roster. The bank would do the rest on its own. Calvin listened to all of it without interrupting. The third item was Estelle's estate listing. Turode had already identified it, a $6.8 million Garden District property listed with a boutique real estate firm on Magazine Street, currently under active marketing with 2 interested parties in preliminary discussions. The property included a private dock with direct water access. That dock sat on a parcel whose access rights, as of that morning, fell under Dewberry Oaks port jurisdiction. Turode would file a standard port jurisdiction notice on the parcel. It was a routine administrative filing, the kind that happened dozens of times a year across the Gulf Coast waterfront. It would be publicly recorded and immediately available to any title search. It would raise no flags until the moment a buyer's attorney ran that search, at which point the sale would halt completely. Clean title transfer would be impossible without written consent from the trust's managing partner. Without Calvin's written consent. Calvin said, and Thibodeau and Marsh. Turode shook his head once. "We do nothing," he said. "We make no contact. We send nothing. When Fontaine Shipping's numbers start moving, Thibodeau and Marsh's partners will pull the account financials themselves. They will see the exposure. They will make their own decisions about Dominique's partnership vote. We don't need to touch that one. It falls on its own. Calvin sat with that for a moment. It was elegant precisely because it was invisible. No retaliation, no vendetta that could be named or argued against. Just the natural, lawful consequence of a new ownership structure settling into place like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples would move outward on their own. There was one more decision. "When it comes time," Calvin said, "I want to be known. Not yet. But when the moment is right, I want them to know it was me." Turreau did not look surprised. He wrote one line on his legal pad and set the pen down. "Understood," he said. "We control the timing." Calvin stood up. He shook Turreau's hand, which he had done at the end of every meeting they had ever had, going back 9 years to the first time a quiet man from the lower ninth sat across this same desk and said he wanted to build something that nobody could see coming. He drove back uptown one last time. The house was empty when he arrived. He went to the bedroom and pulled a bag from the top shelf of the closet, a single duffel, old canvas, the kind Ida May had always called a traveling bag, as distinct from luggage, because luggage implied you were going somewhere important, and a traveling bag just meant you were going. He packed 7 days of clothes. He packed his shaving kit. He took the photograph of his grandmother that sat on his nightstand. He took nothing else. He was in and out in under 20 minutes. He drove back across the city, over the bridge, into the lower ninth, down the familiar street to the yellow house with the white trim that Ida May had kept through every flood, every storm, every season that tried to take it. He let himself in with his key. He set his bag inside the door. Ida May had left red beans on the stove before she passed, and her neighbour, Miss Claudette, had taken up the tradition. There was a pot waiting on the burner, covered and warm, because Miss Claudette had been told Calvin was coming, and in that neighbourhood that was all the reason anyone needed. He fixed himself a bowl. He sat on the porch. He listened to the street settle into evening. And for the first time in 9 years, Calvin Dewberry closed his eyes before 10 o'clock and did not lie awake waiting for something. Across town at Fontaine Shipping's downtown office, a certified letter was sitting in the incoming mail tray. It had arrived at 4:47 that afternoon. Nobody had opened it yet. Day 3. René Fontaine opened the envelope at his desk on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee in his other hand. He read the first paragraph. He set the coffee down. He read it again. The letter was from Dewberry Oaks Capital. The name meant nothing to him. What meant something was the number. A tripling of the terminal lease rates for facilities 7, 11, and 14, effective upon 90-day notice, non-negotiable, with a compliance acknowledgement required within 30 days. René called Dominique before he called his own attorney. She didn't recognize the name either. They spent 40 minutes on the phone trying to trace Dewberry Oaks through every public registry either of them could access. Nothing clear came back. René told her it was probably an aggressive new operator trying to extract concessions. He told her they would push back. He told her it was manageable. It was not manageable. Day 7. The managing partners at Thibodeau and Marsh did not get their information from René. They got it from their own financial analysis team, which ran routine client health reviews every quarter and flagged Fontaine Shipping the moment the revised terminal cost projections hit the firm's risk monitoring system. The numbers were not subtle. If Fontaine Shipping absorbed the new lease rates at full value, their operating margin would invert completely within one fiscal quarter. They would be running at a loss. The partners called an emergency meeting on a Thursday afternoon. Dominique was not invited to that meeting. She found out about it when her direct supervisor called her into his office afterward and told her, in the careful language of men who have practiced delivering bad news, that her partnership vote was being placed on indefinite hold pending client stability review. Her $340,000 performance bonus was frozen by the same determination. Dominique sat very still in that chair. She asked how long indefinite meant. Her supervisor said he could not give her a timeline. She walked out of his office and back to her desk and did not speak to anyone for the remainder of the afternoon. Day 12. Commerce Gulf Bank's commercial lending division sent a formal notice to Fontaine Shipping and Transport. The $4.2 million operating line was being called. The bank cited revised risk projections and deteriorating collateral position. They were given 45 days to satisfy the balance. René drove to Estelle's house that evening without calling first. He sat across from his mother in the same formal sitting room where 9 years of Sunday dinners had happened, and told her they needed the estate sale to close immediately. The listing at $6.8 million was their fastest path to the liquidity the bank was demanding. Estelle said the buyers were still in preliminary discussions. René said preliminary was not fast enough. The conversation got loud. It was the first time in either of their lives that money had felt like something that could run out. Day 18. The buyer's attorney ran a standard title search on the Garden District property. It came back flagged. The private dock access parcel was subject to a port jurisdiction notice filed by Dewberry Oaks Capital, publicly recorded, procedurally standard, and absolutely immovable without written consent from the trust's managing partner. Clean title transfer was impossible. The buyers withdrew within 24 hours. Estelle's realtor called and said she was pulling the listing until the jurisdiction issue could be resolved. Estelle called René. René had no answer. Neither of them had any idea who to call at Dewberry Oaks Capital. Every number they found routed to a general commercial inquiry line. Every letter went to a registered agent address in Delaware. The name on the jurisdiction notice was the trust itself. No person. No face. No opening. Day 22. Beau Arsenault had been watching the Fontaine family's situation the way a man watches weather moving in from the coast, with professional attention and personal calculation. His 3 largest Gulf Coast clients had already begun making quiet inquiries at competing firms. They did not want the exposure. When the third one transferred out, Beau understood exactly what the math meant for his practice. He sent Dominique a text message that evening. 4 sentences. He said he cared about her. He said the timing was not working. He said he hoped she understood. He said he wished her well. Dominique read it standing in the kitchen of the uptown house, the same kitchen where she had handed Calvin the divorce papers 3 weeks earlier, and she did not respond. Day 28. René hired a commercial investigator. He gave him the name Dewberry Oaks Capital and the Delaware Trust registration and told him to find the principals. The investigator came back in 4 days, which was fast because once you knew where to look, the blind trust structure was navigable. It just required someone who knew how to read the layered filings. The investigator returned one name. Day 30. René called Dominique at 11 in the morning. She answered on the second ring. He told her the investigator had come back. He told her the trust's managing partner, the founding principal of Dewberry Oaks Capital, the man who now owned every terminal Fontaine Shipping needed to breathe. He read her the name slowly, the way you read something you cannot quite believe is printed on the page in front of you. Calvin Dewberry. The silence on the line lasted long enough that René said her name twice to check if she was still there. She was still there. She hung up without saying a word, got into her car, drove to the Thibodeau and Marsh parking garage, and pulled into her space. She turned the engine off. She did not get out. She sat in that car for 40 minutes while the city moved around her outside the concrete walls. And the thing she had been so certain of, her future, her career, her clean and unencumbered next chapter, rearranged itself into something she did not have words for yet. Then she picked up her phone. She called Calvin. He answered on the first ring. She started to speak, and he said, quietly and without any heat in his voice at all, "I know why you're calling. I'll meet you." He arrived at 7 in the evening. No attorney, no folder, no prepared documents, just Calvin Dewberry in a plain dark shirt and his good shoes, standing at the door of a garden district house that had always made him feel like a guest who had overstayed a welcome he was never actually given. Dominique let him in without speaking. She stood back from the door the way you stand back from something you are not sure of anymore. The formal sitting room was exactly as it had always been. The crown moulding, the oil portrait of Estelle's mother above the fireplace, the chairs arranged in a way that had always said, without any words attached, that some people belonged in this room and some people were merely permitted to enter it. Estelle was seated in her chair near the window. René stood to the side with his arms folded, the posture of a man who had decided in advance that this meeting was going to go a specific way. Calvin stood in the center of the room. He did not sit. He looked at the three of them, Estelle in her chair, René at the wall, Dominique near the doorway, and he let the silence hold for a long moment, the way you hold a note before resolving it. Nobody in this room had ever allowed him that kind of silence before. They always filled it. They filled it now. René spoke first. He said this had gone far enough. He said there was clearly room for a commercial resolution, and that is what they were here to discuss. He said the lease rates were punitive, and everyone in the room knew it, and if Calvin wanted to sit down like a reasonable man, they could work out an arrangement that served everyone. Calvin looked at him. "This is not a negotiation," he said. René started again. Calvin did not let him finish. "I said what I said." The room went quiet in a different way after that. Not the silence of a pause, the silence of a door closing. Dominique's voice, when it came, was smaller than he had ever heard it. She asked him why. Just that word, standing on its own. Why? As if the question contained everything she didn't know how to organize into a full sentence. Calvin turned to face her completely. He took his time. He wanted every word to land where it was meant to land, and he was not going to rush a single one of them. "You spent 9 years telling your mother I came from nothing, Dominique," he said. "What you didn't know was that every promotion you chased, every bonus you counted, every plan you made for your future, all of it ran through me. You filed those papers the same morning I closed the deal your whole career needed to breathe." He let that sit. He let her hold it. "You didn't leave me," he said. "You left your lifeline." Dominique's face did not move at first. Then something behind it did, something structural, something load-bearing, and the composure she had worn like armor for 9 years simply gave way, not in anger, not in screaming, in the slow and devastating way of a woman who has just understood, fully and completely and with no room for revision, the scale of what she did not know. Her hand came up to her mouth, her eyes filled. She did not make a sound for a long moment, and that silence was louder than anything she could have said. René took a step forward and started to speak again. His voice was harder now, stripped of the negotiating language, down to something raw underneath it. He said Calvin had no right. He said this was not finished. He said there were attorneys, and there were courts, and there were ways that things like this got handled properly. Calvin did not look at him when he answered. "You know where to send the paperwork?" he said. "Marcus Turo. His address is on the lease agreements you've already received." Then he turned to Estelle. He had been saving this, not out of cruelty, out of the same patience that had gotten him through 9 years of that table, 9 years of that seating arrangement, 9 years of being talked over and dismissed and measured against a standard he had never once agreed to be measured by. Estelle was already drawing herself up. already reaching for the register of woman who controls the room. Her chin lifted, her hands settled in her lap. She started to speak with the particular authority of a woman who has never once had the last word taken from her. Calvin said quietly, "My grandfather Earl Dewberry built what your family inherited. He just built it in a place you never thought to look." Estelle's mouth stayed open. Nothing came out. He turned. He picked up nothing because he had brought nothing. He walked through the formal entryway, past the oil portrait, past the flowers Estelle always kept fresh, because the appearance of a well-kept house was the closest thing to a religion she had ever practiced. He opened the front door himself and walked out into the Garden District evening, and he did not look back once. He drove across the city. He parked at the overlook above the port. Below him, Terminals 7, 11, and 14 were lit up against the dark water, the cranes moving in their slow, mechanical rhythm, the ships sitting wide and patient in the channel. 47 miles of waterfront, 14 ports, 3 rail corridors, all of it confirmed, sealed, and transferred to a Delaware blind trust bearing the name of a quiet man from the lower 9th Ward that nobody had ever thought to ask about. Calvin sat there for a long time. He was not angry. He was not triumphant in the showy way that the Fontaines would have been had the positions been reversed. He was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. He was finished. 6 months passed. The city kept moving the way New Orleans always moves, unhurried, layered, indifferent to the private reckonings of families who thought their names meant more than their actions. The port kept running, the ships kept coming in, and the man who owned the ground they docked on went to bed each night in his grandmother's restored yellow house on a quiet street in the lower 9th Ward, and slept exactly as well as a man with a clear conscience sleeps. The Fontaine family's ending was not dramatic. It was administrative, which is its own kind of devastating. Fontaine Shipping and Transport restructured under the new terminal lease terms after exhausting every legal avenue Turreau had already anticipated and prepared for. René Fontaine stepped down as chief financial officer in month 3, citing personal reasons in a statement that fooled no one who had been paying attention. The company did not collapse. It contracted, shed 40% of its Gulf Coast volume, and limped forward under new management that had no choice but to operate within the terms Dewberry Oaks Capital set. The Fontaine name was still on the door, but the name no longer meant what it had meant on that first Sunday dinner when Estelle had looked at Calvin across a long table and decided he was nothing. Estelle's Garden District estate sold in month 4. The final price was $4.9 million, $1.9 million below the original listing after the port jurisdiction issue was cleared through Calvin's written consent, which Turreau provided on a standard form, signed without ceremony, returned in 3 business days. Estelle moved into a smaller house in Métairie. She still wore pearls, but there was no oil portrait above the fireplace in the new place, and no long table with chairs arranged to tell people where they belonged. Dominique left Thibodeau and Marsh before the partnership vote was formally cancelled. She did not wait to be told. She resigned on a Wednesday morning, cleaned out her office by noon, and began the long and necessary work of rebuilding a professional reputation that had been constructed without her knowledge on a foundation she had not laid herself. Word around the industry was that she was doing the work honestly now. Calvin bore her no ongoing malice. What had needed to be said had been said. What had needed to be known was now known. He did not think about her the way she had thought about him, constantly, comparatively, like a measuring stick. He thought about what came next. What came next was the Earl Dewberry Community Port Fellowship. The announcement came in month 5, $12 million, fully endowed, established through Dewberry Oaks Capital in the name of a man who had spent 40 years working the docks and the loading floors and the maintenance corridors of the Gulf Coast without anyone in the Fontaine family ever thinking to ask what his grandson had been watching all that time. The fellowship provided full scholarships in logistics, maritime commerce, and infrastructure finance, exclusively for students from the lower Ninth Ward. The first cohort was 12 students. The second cohort, already enrolled for the following year, was 24. The groundbreaking ceremony was held on a Saturday morning in October on a lot 3 blocks from Ida May's house, where the new community centre was being built. Miss Claudette came. Half the block came. A pastor from the church on Claiborne Avenue said a prayer that went longer than anyone expected and was worth every minute of it. A woman named Josephine Caillou stood near the back of the crowd in a hard hat and a safety orange vest, holding a set of site drawings. She was a civil engineer hired by the construction firm managing the build. She had read about the fellowship in The Advocate and had specifically requested the assignment when it came up in her firm's project rotation. After the ceremony, when the crowd was thinning and Calvin was shaking the last of the hands and accepting the last of the congratulations, Josephine approached him with the directness of someone who does not waste other people's time. She introduced herself by her full name and her title. She said the foundation work on the eastern wing needed his sign-off on a minor grade adjustment. He looked at the drawing. He signed where she indicated. She thanked him. Then she asked, simply, and without any ceremony, what had made him start it. Calvin looked at the lot, the cleared ground, the framing going up on the western side, the students from the first cohort who were standing together near the entrance talking in the bright October light. "Somebody threw something away that was worth keeping," he said. "I just wanted to make sure it landed somewhere it could do something." Josephine looked at him for a moment. She nodded once, the way you nod at an answer that doesn't require a follow-up. She rolled her drawings under her arm and went back to work. Calvin watched her go. He went home that evening to the yellow house with the white trim. He stood in the front room for a moment in the quiet, the way you stand in a place that has always meant something to you and now means something more. On the mantel above the fireplace, in a small plain frame that Ida May's neighbor, Miss Claudette, had put together without being asked, was the Port of New Orleans visitor badge. Worn at the edges, the lanyard faded, the laminate peeling at one corner. It looked exactly like what it was. A plain badge that a woman had once thrown in the trash without asking what it was for, and a man had retrieved without a word and clipped back to his sun visor and carried for 9 more years until the day it was no longer needed. Power kept quiet is not weakness, it is patience, and patience, given enough time, becomes the only thing that was ever real. The next morning, Calvin Dewberry put on his jacket and clipped a new badge to his lapel. This one was clean and crisp, the lettering sharp and unambiguous. It said, Dewberry Oaks Capital, Managing Partner. He drove to the community center on the lot 3 blocks from his grandmother's house, parked the same car he had been driving for 4 years, and walked through the front entrance into the building that was going to matter long after the Fontaine family name faded into something nobody felt the need to mention at Sunday dinners anymore. So here is what I want to ask you, and I want you to think about it seriously. If you had been in Calvin's position, 9 years of silence, 9 years of that table, 9 years of knowing exactly what you held while the people around you laughed, what would you have done? Would you have moved sooner? Would you have moved at all? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because I read every single one of them, and I genuinely want to know if this story stayed with you the way I think it did. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it helps more people find stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, do that right now, because we have more coming that you do not want to miss. I will see you in the next one.